We're keeping the commentary section going.
Stop making up reasons for commenting. Just be honest. And tell people it's because the YouTube algorithm promotes the videos, the more comments there are.
Oh, no, you exposed me. I was totally trying to trick you into engaging with the video. How evil.
But hey, since you're already caught in my sinister scheme, let's shake things up. Ask me anything in the comments and I will answer. Sound fair? Now let's get into the story. For weeks before their encounter, her life had been a blur of hospital rooms and unanswered questions. Waking up with no memory of who she was or how she'd been injured left her trapped in a world that felt both familiar and foreign. The doctors had done what they could, but without identification or a family to contact, she was left to piece together her identity alone. Each day felt heavier, her hope fading as the reality of her situation sank in, until she crossed paths with Morgan, a journalist whose curiosity and compassion would change everything. She cut him off, insisting the decision should be hers, not his, especially since his newspaper had already agreed to help. He understood, but reminded her that he had personal concerns. If anything happened to him because of the photos, she'd feel responsible. He urged her to wait, hoping her memory might return on its own. Frustrated, she threatened to call another newspaper if he wouldn't take the photos, which only annoyed him further. He grumbled about her stubbornness, but she pushed back, demanding he make a choice. Finally, exasperated, he agreed to take the photos, though he still thought the whole idea was reckless. Her mood brightened instantly. She explained that the police were setting up a hotline, with calls going directly to the station for screening. He asked why she hadn't mentioned this earlier, and she quipped that he never asked. At least it offered some protection. When he questioned her plans after the hospital, she admitted uncertainty. The hospital was struggling to cover her expenses without a social security number, and therapy seemed unlikely without funding. If they couldn't even pay for her stay, therapy was out of the question. He was alarmed. She'd be released soon with no place to go and no way to work. She wasn't surprised by his concern. She hoped the photos would help locate family or friends before her release in a few days. He suggested shelters, but she explained most were full, primarily serving women escaping difficult situations. Despite trying to stay composed, tears welled up in her eyes. And for the first time, Morgan saw just how vulnerable she really was. It was clear she had no other options. He handed her a napkin and began adjusting his camera, promising to edit out any medical equipment from the photos to hide the fact she was still hospitalized. After a few shots, he assured her they'd appear in the next day's paper. Before leaving, Morgan ran into Charlie, who asked if he'd managed to dissuade her. He hadn't. She had no choice. The police were still calling shelters, but nothing was available. That evening, Morgan shared the story with his wife, Bria, reflecting on how terrifying it must be not to remember anything, not even your own name. Bria was less sympathetic, assuming there'd be a shelter for her eventually, but Morgan wasn't so sure. He felt she needed family, someone to help trigger her memories. The next morning, Morgan arrived at work early, bypassing his usual routine to grab a fresh copy of the paper from the press room. He planned to bring it to the hospital. His colleague Andy joked about his early arrival but handed him an assignment at City Hall since he was already headed out. Morgan appreciated the gesture and left for the hospital. When he arrived, Charlie was still on duty. Morgan showed him the front page photo and they both hoped it would lead to something. Entering her room quietly, he found her resting, but she sensed his presence and smiled when he showed her the paper. She was thrilled with the photo and grateful for his help, though she admitted she still had no backup plan. The police were trying to find her a shelter, but most were overcrowded or had shut down due to funding issues. A small fundraiser among the hospital staff was in the works to give her something to start with. Morgan realized he could organize something similar at the newsroom. He asked a fellow reporter, Rick Buss, to gather donations. By the time Morgan returned from his assignments, Rick had collected over $400, and Morgan added more from his own pocket. That evening, over a glass of wine, Morgan brought up the idea of letting the woman stay with them. Bria was immediately resistant, pointing out that they barely used their third bedroom and had no idea who this woman really was. She reminded him that the woman's life might still be in danger, and bringing her into their home could put them at risk too. Morgan countered that the police believed she was safe now and that no one would know where she was staying. He assured Bria it would be temporary, just until the woman found someone who could help her. Bria wasn't convinced, worried about what might happen if the woman's memories returned in a traumatic way. But Morgan insisted she was level-headed, even with amnesia. Eventually, Bria relented, but only after making Morgan promise that if things didn't work out, he'd find her another place to stay. Morgan teased her, suggesting she might end up liking their guest. Bria rolled her eyes, but the tension between them eased. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Bria asked if this meant they'd have a house guest. Morgan pulled her close, whispering that he loved her. And they both drifted off to sleep, uncertain but hopeful. The following day, Morgan checked in with Charlie to see if they had found a place for the woman. Charlie explained that no permanent solution had come up yet, but the lieutenant had used his ID to secure her a motel room temporarily. The officers had pooled together nearly $600 to help cover the costs. Morgan added another $500 from an envelope he brought, which surprised and relieved Charlie. Along with the money, Morgan had packed one of Bria's tracksuits, unsure if the woman had anything appropriate to wear when she was discharged. Charlie chuckled, mentioning that the station's lost and found only turned up a men's shirt and pants, which clearly wouldn't be ideal. Morgan then revealed that he and Bria had decided to let her stay in their apartment. Their third bedroom had been sitting empty, and they figured they might as well use it. Charlie was shocked, but assured Morgan the precinct would be thrilled to hear it. To ease Bria's nerves about potential danger, Charlie promised to request regular patrols around their apartment complex, just as they would have done for any motel. When Morgan entered her hospital room, she greeted him with a warm smile, recognizing his voice. He told her he'd brought some gifts, Bria's workout clothes and sneakers, figuring they were about the same size. She gratefully accepted, joking about how ridiculous she'd look in the oversized men's clothes from the police. Morgan then dropped the real surprise. He and Bria were offering her a place to stay until she got back on her feet. She stared at him, waiting for a punchline, but he was serious. Though skeptical, unsure why strangers would be so generous, she saw nothing but sincerity in his face. Morgan reassured her it was her choice, no strings attached, and that Bria would be home most of the time, so she wouldn't feel alone. Before she could respond, Morgan handed her the envelope with the $500 the newsroom had collected. Overwhelmed, tears welled in her eyes, but Morgan urged her to see it as a bit of good fortune in a tough time. While she changed, Morgan stepped into the hall to talk with Charlie, mentioning he'd taken the night shift to have more time to help her adjust. Soon, a nurse arrived with a wheelchair, asking if Morgan was family. After explaining the situation, the nurse smiled, noting the woman seemed to have found her knight in shining armor. Inside, the woman admitted she was scared to leave the hospital's safety. The nurse reassured her that with people like Morgan and Bria in her corner, she'd be in good hands. Morgan pulled the car up front as the nurse wheeled her downstairs. As she climbed in, he noticed how well she filled out the tracksuit, almost like Bria. Before heading to the mall, he asked if she had a name she wanted to use, explaining they couldn't keep calling her the mystery woman. After a pause, she chose Linda. Simple and easy to remember, though she hoped it wouldn't be for long. At the store, Linda carefully selected practical clothes: jeans, skirts, casual tops, and comfortable shoes. Morgan gave her space when she picked out lingerie, but suggested sticking with the basics. Watching her hand over $300 at checkout, nearly a third of her money, Morgan could see how hard it was for her to spend it, even on essentials. When they returned home, Bria greeted them at the door. Morgan introduced Linda by her new name, and Linda expressed deep gratitude for their kindness. Bria brushed it off, saying they were happy to help. As Morgan had to leave for work soon, Bria suggested a quick lunch. Linda eagerly accepted, joking that anything was better than hospital food. Over soup and sandwiches, Bria realized how strange it was to talk with someone who remembered nothing of their life. Thankfully, Linda was curious and asked about Morgan and Bria's marriage, lightening the mood. Just as the conversation warmed up, Morgan's phone rang. It was Jerry Wilson, a respected cop, calling about Linda. Jerry mentioned his sister-in-law, a psychiatrist, was willing to offer therapy pro bono. She suspected Linda's amnesia stemmed from prolonged trauma, not just the shooting, and warned that recovering her memories could be emotionally painful. Morgan said he'd discuss it with Linda and call back. Jerry added that the psychiatrist worked in Des Plaines, meaning Linda would need to take public transport unless Morgan or Bria could drive her. After jotting down the contact info Bria brought him, Morgan looked across the table at Linda. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, she wasn't facing it alone. Morgan quickly jotted down the psychiatrist's contact information while Bria and Linda watched him, eager to hear what was going on. After hanging up, he explained that Jerry, a cop friend, had arranged for his sister-in-law, a psychiatrist, to work with Linda for free to help recover her memory. He warned them it wouldn't be easy, but they'd talk more when he got home from work. Linda was thrilled at the opportunity, and Bria shared in her excitement. That evening, they sat together to discuss the call in detail. Morgan stressed how emotionally challenging the therapy could be, but Linda was unwavering. She was determined to uncover her past, no matter how difficult. The next morning, Bria helped Linda call the psychiatrist's office. They put the call on speaker, and after explaining the situation, the receptionist promised the doctor would call back shortly. Nervous, Linda poured them both coffee, her hands trembling. She admitted her fear. What if the therapy didn't work? She joked that she might even be a psychiatrist herself and not know it. Bria reassured her, reminding her that medical advances like hypnosis could help jog her memory. As they waited, the tension grew, but finally the phone rang. Dr. Wahlberg explained the potential emotional toll, but praised Linda's courage when she insisted she was ready. They scheduled an appointment for the following day, with Bria agreeing to drive her. Later that night, Morgan returned home to find Linda already asleep. Bria filled him in, admitting she'd grown fond of Linda and admired her strength. She confessed she didn't know how she'd handle being in Linda's position. The next morning, while Morgan was at work, Linda wandered into the kitchen, looking tired. She admitted she hadn't slept well, her mind racing about the upcoming appointment. She also realized she'd forgotten to buy a robe. Bria offered an old one from her closet, and Linda gratefully accepted. After some light conversation, Linda showered, finding the robe and a few makeup items waiting on her bed. They arrived at Dr. Wahlberg's office early. As they sat in the car, Linda stared out the window, silent. Bria asked if she wanted company, but Linda declined, admitting she was scared but determined. She worried about what she might discover. What if her past was darker than she imagined? Bria reassured her, encouraging her to go inside. With a deep breath, Linda straightened up and entered the building. Inside, a friendly receptionist greeted her, confirming her name and calling Dr. Wahlberg. The doctor, a professional-looking woman in her 40s, welcomed Linda warmly and led her into the office. She explained that memory recovery often came in fragments, brief flashes or full episodes triggered by sensory cues. She encouraged Linda to carry a journal and note any memories and their possible triggers. Linda was relieved to hear the doctor's optimism, though Dr. Wahlberg warned that some memories might remain buried. The session focused on cognitive exercises designed to stimulate Linda's mind. Dr. Wahlberg avoided hypnosis for now, opting for tasks and puzzles to activate dormant parts of her brain. By the end of the hour, Linda felt hopeful for the first time since waking up in the hospital. Bria was waiting in the lobby, and Linda couldn't resist playing a joke. She told Bria she discovered she was born in Oklahoma to a cattle farmer. Bria's shocked expression made Linda burst into laughter, and even the receptionist joined in. After setting up her next appointment, Linda asked Bria to stop at a store for a journal and pens on their way home. Back at the apartment, Linda changed into jeans and started cleaning while Bria prepared dinner. They were becoming a solid team. Weeks passed in this new routine. Bria drove Linda to therapy and wandered the mall while waiting. On the way home from Linda's 5th session, they stopped at the grocery store. As they unloaded the bags in the parking lot, Linda overheard 2 men talking near a car. "I'm telling you, it's her. She's alive. You're the one who said the witch was dead." The words triggered a vivid, horrifying image, a dark figure looming over her. Panic surged through Linda. She dropped her groceries and sprinted past Bria, who was just unlocking the apartment door. "Linda, what's wrong?" Bria called after her, alarmed. Linda bolted into her room, curled up on the bed, hugging her knees, and rocked back and forth, her face pale and distant. Bria rushed in, gently rubbing her back, trying to calm her down. "Linda, what happened? Was it something in the parking lot?" Linda didn't respond, staring blankly ahead. "Did you remember something?" Bria pressed. Finally, Linda nodded slowly, her eyes filling with fear. "Oh my God, do you remember what happened to you?" Linda whispered, her voice trembling. "I heard him in the parking lot. He said, 'The witch is dead.'" "I've heard that before. I remember—" Bria's heart raced. "Stay here. Don't move," she said firmly, heading for the phone to call Morgan and the police. Bria rushed to the parking lot, but the men Linda had overheard were already gone. She grabbed the groceries, locked the car, and returned to find Linda a bit calmer. Although Linda hadn't recognized the men, something had been triggered. She suddenly remembered her name, first thinking it was Corey, then realizing it was Kareen. The last name, however, remained out of reach, leaving her frustrated. Bria quickly called Dr. Wahlberg, but the therapist was fully booked. She advised Linda to write down everything she remembered and what triggered it. Bria then contacted Morgan at work, knowing he'd be alarmed by her rare call. After hearing the situation, Morgan instructed her to call the police immediately. When Morgan arrived home, Lieutenant Ashwood and a patrol officer were already there, taking Linda's statement. Morgan was surprised by the lieutenant's presence, as they'd only met a few times. The officers believed the shooter might still be in the area, possibly connected to someone in their apartment complex. Soon after, another officer arrived with news. They'd found a car matching the one that had dropped Linda at the hospital, complete with the same bumper sticker. The car was registered to a 19-year-old named Brian Kelsey, but he didn't live in the complex. This complicated things, but the police decided to monitor the car to see who might be using it. With the suspect still at large, the lieutenant suggested moving Corrine to a secure motel. The department would cover the cost, and a female officer would stay with her for protection. Morgan and Bria declined additional security at their apartment, confident they could handle things. At the motel, Officer Janet met Corrine. After securing the room, they ordered pizza and chatted to ease the tension. Corrine learned that Lieutenant Ashwood had recently gone through a messy divorce, something Janet shared to lighten the mood. Their conversation drifted to the challenges of police work and personal lives, with Corrine reflecting on her own situation and wondering if she might be married without even knowing it. Corrine explained how hearing the man in the parking lot triggered her memory, though it was more of a feeling than a clear recollection. She also mentioned her upcoming therapy session, hopeful that more memories would surface. Meanwhile, back at the station, Lieutenant Ashwood learned that Brian Kelsey had an alibi. He'd been at work when Corrine heard the voice. But Kelsey had been visiting a friend in the complex, Carl Langford. Suspecting Langford might be involved, Ashwood ordered patrol officers to bring him in for questioning. Kelsey was kept in custody to see if further interrogation could link him to the case. The next morning, Janet stayed with Corrine, declining an officer swap since her husband was out of town and Corrine needed a ride to therapy. At the station, officers continued their investigation, hoping to piece together the truth before Corrine's memories put her in more danger. Corey had just stepped out of the shower when Janet ended a call with her sergeant. The police had one suspect in custody and collected a DNA sample from a cup he used. They were now on their way to pick up the second man, who lived in Corey's apartment complex. If they secured another DNA match, they could tie both men to the crime and hopefully get them to reveal the identity of a third accomplice. Though Corey tried to stay calm, fear lingered. She collapsed onto the bed, sighing in relief, finally feeling a small sense of freedom. Janet assured her she'd stay for the day and take her to therapy later. Corey called Bria to let her know she didn't need a ride. Bria sounded upbeat, mentioning the patrol cars outside were likely there to arrest the suspect from their complex. Corey agreed it was unsettling to think someone dangerous had been living so close. Afterward, Janet and Corey went to a diner popular with cops, a safe choice in case anyone tried something. Back at the motel, they chatted about Janet's family life until it was time for Corey's therapy session. That's when Corey realized she'd left her journal at the apartment, something Dr. Wahlberg insisted she keep close to record any returning memories. Janet agreed to swing by the apartment to grab it on their way. At the apartment, Corey used her key, knowing Morgan was at work. As she walked toward the bedrooms, she overheard Bria on the phone, her tone tense. Bria was telling someone named Bob she wouldn't go out with him again, accusing him of sedating her. But she admitted the closeness had been amazing. Corey, stunned, immediately confronted Bria about cheating on Morgan. Bria tried to explain, but Corey was too shocked to listen. She grabbed her journal and left, brushing past Bria without another word. Janet noticed Corey's shaken demeanor and asked if something had happened. Corey brushed it off, insisting it was nothing. The ride to Dr. Wahlberg's office was silent. The doctor quickly noticed Corey's distressed state and asked if she was remembering more. Corey denied it, but soon admitted the real reason for her turmoil. She had just discovered Bria was cheating on Morgan. She was torn, feeling indebted to Bria and Morgan for their kindness, yet believing Morgan deserved to know the truth. Dr. Wahlberg sympathized, but didn't offer a clear solution. She suggested Corey take time to understand the situation before deciding. The doctor explained that people cheat for complex reasons, and sometimes it's better if the guilty party confesses rather than someone else revealing the truth. Corey struggled with the idea of staying in the apartment, feeling trapped between loyalty and honesty. After Corey calmed down, Dr. Wahlberg shifted the conversation back to Corey's memories, hoping to make progress. Meanwhile, at the police station, Lieutenant Ashwood and Detective Nobles were interrogating their suspects separately. Nobles, usually calm and smiling, startled Brian, one of the suspects. by slamming his hand on the table and accusing him of attack. Nobles claimed they had DNA evidence linking Brian and his friend to Corey. Panicked, Brian insisted they hadn't harmed Corey. He explained they found her injured on the roadside and initially left her in the woods, assuming she wouldn't survive. Later, guilt drove Brian to return alone, and when he saw she was still alive, he took her to the hospital without telling his friends. He feared their reaction if they found out. Back at the station, the officers hoped to use Brian's confession to track down the third suspect and piece together the full story, while Corey wrestled with the emotional fallout of her discovery, unsure of what to do next. Detective Nobles trusted his instincts. He believed the suspect was telling the truth. He stopped the recording, removed the tape, and handed the young man a notepad, instructing him to write down everything he'd confessed, including the name of the third accomplice. Nobles then left the interrogation room and headed toward the duty sergeant. When asked if he'd secured a confession, Nobles confirmed that while the suspect admitted to finding the woman, he denied shooting her. This revelation frustrated both the sergeant and Lieutenant Ashwood, who worried that the real shooter might still be out there. Nobles had already requested a search warrant for Langford's apartment, though he doubted it would yield much. He also suspected the detained young man had a conscience. He claimed his friends would have beaten him if they knew he'd taken the woman to the hospital. Nobles believed that act had likely saved her life. The lieutenant praised Nobles for his work and left to await the written statement. Soon after, it was revealed that the third suspect was Zach Kelsey, the older brother of the detained man. Their parents, shocked and devastated, cooperated fully with the police. A search of their home turned up a .22 Colt, but forensics confirmed it hadn't been fired in years. The case took a new turn. Investigators realized the men responsible for attacking Corey weren't the ones who had injured her with a firearm. While the attackers were in custody, the true assailant was still at large, and the investigation continued. After her therapy session, Corey decided to spend another night at the motel with Officer Janet. The next day, she returned to Morgan and Bria's apartment, grateful to Janet for her protection. But as she approached the door, a new anxiety took over. She had to face Bria after discovering her affair. Inside, Bria sat at the kitchen table, still in her robe, her face puffy from crying. She knew this confrontation was inevitable. Corey dropped her bag in her room, then joined Bria at the table with a cup of coffee. The tension between them was palpable. Bria broke the silence, claiming Corey hadn't given her a chance to explain. Corey was skeptical. She'd heard enough on the phone to know something inappropriate had happened, but Bria insisted she hadn't physically cheated on Morgan. She admitted to seeing Bob, an ex-boyfriend, but claimed their encounter at the motel had happened before she and Morgan rekindled their relationship, and that Bob had likely sedated her. Bria explained their history. She and Morgan had been high school sweethearts but drifted apart after graduation. While Morgan focused on his journalism career, Bria dated other men, including Bob. When she and Morgan reconnected, she was still seeing Bob, but quickly broke it off when her feelings for Morgan deepened. Corey was still confused. Bria admitted that after running into Bob months ago, they began meeting for lunch, which turned into dinners when Morgan worked night shifts. Bria swore she never intended for anything physical to happen, but during one evening out, things spiraled out of control. She couldn't remember how they ended up at the motel, but she believed Bob had sedated her. Fortunately, someone at the hotel had intervened, helping her get home safely. Corey felt slightly relieved, but still urged Bria to come clean to Morgan. She shared advice from Dr. Wahlberg, who said it would be better for Bria to confess herself rather than risk Morgan finding out from someone else. Bria hesitated, fearing it would destroy their marriage, but Corey promised to support her through it. That evening, when Morgan returned home, he sensed tension in the air, but chalked it up to stress from the police investigation. Both women assured him everything was fine, and he shared the news about the suspect's arrests, thinking the unease in the room was just lingering anxiety. Later that night, Corey had a vivid dream. She saw herself being dragged from a car, the door slamming shut as tires screeched away. The dream felt so real that when she woke up, she realized it wasn't a dream at all. It was a memory. Her heart pounded as she tried to recall more, but the details were slipping away. She remembered her mother being in trouble, but nothing else was clear. Frustrated and scared, she grabbed her journal and scribbled down everything she could before the memories faded completely. Not knowing what had happened was almost worse than not remembering at all. Exhausted, she cried herself to sleep, haunted by the unanswered questions. The next morning, Corey woke up and immediately checked her diary to confirm the memories from the night before were real. They were, She'd written about the fear and loneliness of being pulled from a car, along with faint recollections of her mother's distress. The memories unsettled her, making her question whether she even wanted to remember more, as everything so far was filled with pain. The smell of coffee drew her to the kitchen, where she was surprised to see Morgan. Embarrassed by her robe, she quickly tightened it, realizing he was home because it was Saturday and his day off. Morgan mentioned he'd start a night shift on Monday, and Corey, still flustered, grabbed a coffee and sat down. She casually mentioned she was starting to remember more. Morgan was excited, but Corey wasn't sure it was a good thing. The fragments were dark. Something about her mother when she was young and more recent flashes of being dragged from a car. Bria soon joined them, and Morgan shared the news. Corey explained the memories were brief and unpleasant, mostly leaving her with more questions than answers. As they discussed it, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Bria checked through the peephole and returned with Lieutenant Gerard, who was off duty. Gerard claimed he stopped by to see if Corey remembered anything new. While she shared what little she could, it became clear his visit was more personal than professional. Corey noticed his subtle flirting and, despite herself, found it flattering. She hadn't considered romance since waking in the hospital, but Gerard's presence sparked something new. After Gerard left, Bria teased Corey about the obvious interest. Corey admitted she liked him but felt uncertain. She didn't even know who she was yet. For all she knew, she could be married with kids. The thought surprised Bria and Morgan, but Corey brushed it off with a joke, referencing things she'd learned from Janet, the officer she stayed with. Morgan suggested they all go out to enjoy the day. Corey mentioned she had Gerard's number from when he gave it to her for emergencies. They called, and Gerard eagerly accepted the invitation. The group spent the day at Navy Pier, riding the Ferris wheel and having lunch by the lake. They ended the day with a trip to the Field Museum. By the time they returned home, everyone was exhausted but happy. Corey joked about how she couldn't remember the last time she'd had so much fun, making everyone laugh. They invited Gerard to stay for pizza, and it was nearly 10 p.m. when he finally left. Corey walked him to his car, and Gerard took the opportunity to ask if she'd be interested in seeing him again. Corey liked him, but asked if he was ready to date after his divorce. Gerard, realizing Janet must have shared his personal life, laughed and assured her he was. Corey agreed to dinner, and they parted with smiles. Later that week, Corey discussed her flashbacks with Dr. Wahlberg. The therapist suggested that recent stress, like Bria's confession about her affair, might be triggering her memories. Corey wasn't thrilled with the idea of stress being the key to unlocking her past, but if it helped, she was willing to endure it. Before leaving, Corey mentioned Gerard. Dr. Wahlberg, who knew him through her brother-in-law Jerry, reassured Corey that Gerard was a good man. Corey left the session smiling, feeling hopeful for the first time in a while. On the way home, she and Bria stopped to buy a thank you card for Jerry. That evening, as Bria made dinner, Corey sat at the kitchen table writing her note, grateful for the unexpected turns her life was taking. Meanwhile, across town, mafia boss Vito Generici confronted his enforcer Tony. The FBI had found Johnny's body, and rumors were circulating about the girl who had stumbled into the hospital near the crime scene. Vito didn't want to take any chances. He ordered Tony to find and eliminate her, making it clear that another failure wouldn't be tolerated. With mafia connections in both the police and media, it wouldn't take long to track her down. A few nights later, Bria was lounging on the couch, half watching a late-night talk show when Morgan returned from his night shift. She immediately sensed something was wrong. He didn't greet her, not even a glance, and instead headed straight to the kitchen, grabbing a beer from the fridge without saying a word. Meanwhile, Corey and Gerard had just come back from a date. They were still in the parking lot, chatting, when Corey noticed Morgan pulling in. The tension in his posture and the way he slammed the car door set off alarms in her mind. She knew something was off and told Gerard she needed to check on things. Though he offered to come along, she insisted she could handle it and briskly crossed the lot, leaving Gerard to wait in his car, uneasy but unwilling to leave. Inside, Bria found Morgan sitting at the kitchen table, beer in hand, his eyes glassy and distant, as if he'd been crying. The tension in the room was suffocating. She cautiously sat across from him, asking what was wrong. Morgan's voice was flat as he brought up Stan McCarthy, a sergeant they'd met at a 4th of July party years ago. Bria barely remembered him, but Morgan continued, explaining that Stan had become a detective in Des Plaines. As Morgan spoke, Bria's heart sank. Des Plaines was where she'd met Bob. Morgan recounted how Stan, investigating a robbery at the Cherry Lane Motel, had seen her there with Bob. He described how Stan had found her in her underwear. clearly intoxicated or sedated, and had helped her get dressed before putting her in a taxi. Bob had fled the scene. Morgan's voice grew louder as he demanded answers, furious that she thought she could get away with cheating. Bria was too overwhelmed with guilt and shame to speak. Just then, Corey stepped in, revealing that she knew about the incident and that Bria had been trying to find the right time to confess. This revelation pushed Morgan over the edge. Feeling betrayed not only by his wife but also by Corey, he stormed out. Gerard, still in the parking lot, watched Morgan leave in a fury. Corey ran to Gerard, explaining the situation, and fearing that Morgan might go after Bob. Gerard, knowing how dangerous this could get, immediately called in a manhunt for Morgan's car, instructing officers to stop him without using force. Back in the apartment, Gerard and Corey pressed Bria for information about Bob's whereabouts. Bria, realizing the gravity of the situation, admitted she didn't know where Bob lived, only that he worked in Plain. Gerard was frustrated but hopeful the police would intercept Morgan in time. 15 minutes later, Gerard received a call. Morgan had been pulled over and was now in a patrol car. When patched through, Morgan was livid, demanding to know why Gerard had put him on a wanted list. Gerard tried to calm him down, urging him to come home and talk things out, but Morgan refused, saying he'd get a motel room instead. Gerard warned him against seeking revenge, reminding him of the consequences. Morgan reluctantly promised to stay away from Bob. After the call, Gerard reassured Bria and Corey that Morgan was safe, though the tension in the room remained thick. Gerard had to leave for work soon, but Corey asked him to stay a little longer. They made coffee and tried to process everything that had happened. When Gerard finally left, Corey found Bria curled up on the couch, trembling with regret and fear. Bria was convinced she'd lost Morgan for good. Corey, despite her anger, comforted Bria, telling her to give Morgan time to cool down. But even she knew it would take a while before things felt normal again. That night, Morgan checked into a cheap motel, feeling more alone than he ever had before. The empty room echoed his emptiness inside. Though tempted to drown his sorrows at the bar across the street, he knew it wouldn't help. The betrayal cut too deep. As he sat on the edge of the bed, questions swirled in his mind. Was Bob the only one? Were there others? He felt like a fool for trusting Bria, and even more betrayed knowing Corey had kept the truth from him. Unable to shake the thoughts, he lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the betrayal and the gnawing question of whether this was truly the end of his marriage. Morgan couldn't help but smirk at the idea of Gerard putting him on a wanted list. The irony wasn't lost on him. Despite the lack of privacy in the modern world, tracking down someone's address was harder than it had been in the days of landlines and phone books. Lying on the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, he racked his brain for ways to find Bob. Maybe someone at the motel where Bob had taken Bria knew something. Exhausted, Morgan finally decided to get some rest, hoping he'd think more clearly in the morning. Meanwhile, Corey and Bria woke up on the couch, necks stiff, hearts heavy from the night before. Morgan hadn't slept well either, tossing and turning until dawn. Even Gerard had a restless night, worried about Morgan doing something reckless. He'd seen too many good guys ruin their lives over betrayal. On his way to work, Gerard spotted Officer Charlie Watt and pulled him aside. He needed to know how Morgan might react to being hurt like this. Charlie, recalling Morgan's fierce loyalty and quick temper, admitted he wouldn't want to be on Morgan's bad side. Gerard didn't like hearing that, but thanked him and suggested Charlie check in with Morgan after his shift. Back at the apartment, Bria and Corey debated how to reach out. They didn't want to seem intrusive, but also didn't want Morgan thinking they didn't care. Bria sent a heartfelt message, apologizing and insisting she'd never intended to sleep with Bob. Corey followed up with a brief, remorseful text, regretting that she hadn't told Morgan sooner. Morgan, sitting at a Denny's for breakfast, glanced at Bria's message but felt nothing. His focus was elsewhere, on finding Bob. Throughout the day, more texts buzzed on his phone, but he ignored them. Later, Charlie called to invite him for a drink, but Morgan declined, claiming he was working the night shift all week. Charlie hung up, still unaware of the deeper situation. That evening, Morgan adjusted his assignments at work to squeeze in a trip to the Cherry Lane Motel. Arriving just after 7, he found a young man at the front desk. Initially considering lying, Morgan decided honesty might work better. He explained that his wife had been sedated there, and he wanted information on the man responsible. The clerk's demeanor softened. He confirmed that nothing had happened between Bria and Bob, explaining that a detective had intervened in time. Unfortunately, the security footage had already been handed over to the police due to a robbery that night. But when Morgan pressed for Bob's whereabouts, the clerk mentioned that Bob drove a silver Hyundai with a personalized license plate. Cast car. That was enough for Morgan. He left the motel with a plan, knowing he had enough police contacts to trace the plate without involving Charlie, who likely knew about the situation from Gerard. Later that night, Morgan returned home. Bria's heart pounded when she saw him, still in the same clothes from the night before. She froze, unsure if he was staying or just grabbing his things. But when he put his camera away, she knew he'd at least be there for the night. Without making eye contact, Morgan asked where Corey was. Bria explained she was out with Gerard, hoping they could talk now that he was home. But Morgan shut her down, saying he wasn't ready. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his beer, struggling to understand how their seemingly happy marriage had come to this. Bria tried to explain herself, insisting she never intended to sleep with Bob, but Morgan wasn't having it. His anger flared, accusing her of playing games. Frustrated, he cut off the conversation, saying he didn't want to talk anymore. At that moment, Corey and Gerard returned from their date. Seeing Morgan's car outside, Gerard decided to check in, trying to lighten the mood with a joke about Morgan being public enemy number one. But Morgan wasn't in the mood for jokes. Gerard cautiously asked if Morgan had found Bob's address, but Morgan denied it, growing defensive. It was clear he wasn't ready to talk, so Gerard kissed Corey goodbye and left. As Corey headed to bed, she called out goodnight, but only Bria responded. She and Morgan sat in silence at the kitchen table until Bria finally asked if he was going to bed. Morgan coldly replied he'd sleep on the couch. Bria, fighting back tears, told him he was welcome in their bed if he changed his mind. But she knew he wouldn't. As she retreated to the bedroom, she whispered, "I love you," unsure if he even heard her. Morgan sat with his lukewarm beer, fixated on finding Bria's lover. Initially, he just wanted to hit the guy, but decided it was better to ask a few questions first, compare his answers with Bria's, and then decide if he still wanted to throw a punch. With Gerard working in the 18th district, Morgan knew he couldn't risk running the license plate there. But he had plenty of friends in the 1st district who might help. He just needed a convincing story. Lying to cops wasn't his style, but he was desperate for answers. Lying on the couch felt foreign, a harsh reminder of how much had changed. He would have given anything to rewind time to before this mess. The next morning, Bria woke with swollen eyes, her face still puffy from crying. She headed to the kitchen, hoping to see Morgan on the couch, but it was empty. Corey, making fresh coffee, told her he'd left before she woke up. Bria had hoped for at least a chance to talk over breakfast, but that hope faded. Meanwhile, Morgan arrived at the 1st District Police Station, scanning for a familiar face. He spotted Bill Taylor and approached him, asking for a favor. He claimed the plate belonged to someone who'd backed into Bria's car and wanted to settle it privately to avoid insurance hassle. Bill, skeptical but trusting, ran the plate and handed over the address in Rosemont. Morgan promised a favor in return, a family photo for Bill's newborn. Knowing traffic would slow him down, Morgan decided to wait until Saturday, his day off, to confront the guy. Later that morning, Bria waited in Dr. Wahlberg's office while Corey had her session. Corey recounted how Morgan found out about Bria's secret and how things spiraled. The doctor sympathized but shifted focus back to Corey, suggesting couples therapy for Bria and Morgan while offering referrals. To help Corey focus, the doctor guided her into a relaxed state, then asked if the name Houston meant anything. At first, Corey dismissed it, but soon memories surfaced, kids calling her Texas on the playground, flashes of her past rushing back. She realized her name was Corrine Houston. Excited, she recalled a man named Harley pulling her out of a car. Though unsure if he was the one who hurt her, the memories were clear enough to bring tears. The doctor revealed that Corey's wallet had been found by some kids near Route 20. Her ID led to the Chicago PD, and Gerard brought the discovery to Dr. Wahlberg, who wanted Corey to recover these memories in a safe environment. On the way home, Corey excitedly shared her breakthrough with Bria, but as they pulled into the lot, they saw Morgan's car. Bria felt a mix of hope and dread. He was home, but would he talk? Corey handed her a couple of business cards for marriage counselors, though Bria doubted Morgan would agree to it. Bria worried that Morgan believed the worst, and Corey suggested a lie detector test to prove her innocence. For the first time, Bria felt a sliver of hope. Back inside, they heard the shower running. Bria checked the time. Morgan had 3 hours before work, Hoping to ease the tension, they decided to cook him lunch. But just as the food was cooking, they heard the front door slam. Bria rushed to the window, only to see Morgan driving off without a word. She returned to the kitchen, deflated. Lunch would be for just the two of them. Now that Morgan had Castens's address, he couldn't think of anything else. He needed a plan. To clear his head, he found a quiet corner in a restaurant, ordered lunch, and sat there nursing multiple cups of coffee while mentally running through every possible scenario. He didn't just want to punch the guy, he wanted answers first. After work, Morgan parked in the back lot and waited until the apartment lights went out, assuming Bria and Corey were asleep. Quietly slipping inside, he crashed on the couch, setting his alarm for 6 a.m. In a few hours, he'd be heading to Rosemont. He wasn't sure exactly how he'd handle the confrontation, but was determined to keep his cool, at least at first. By 6:45 a.m., Morgan was nearing Castens' neighborhood. As he pulled into the apartment complex, he spotted a silver Hyundai leaving in the opposite direction. Swearing under his breath, he quickly turned around and followed, keeping a safe distance. To his surprise, Castens didn't head to work, but instead pulled into a residential area. Morgan watched as he backed into a driveway and popped the trunk. As Morgan approached, another man emerged from the garage with a golf bag. Great, two of them. He considered turning back but decided against it. He was done waiting. By the time Castens closed the trunk, Morgan was standing right in front of him. The look on Castens' face confirmed he recognized him. Tension escalated fast. Castens mocked him, suggesting he couldn't take on both men. But Morgan's glare was enough to make the friend step back, distancing himself from the confrontation. When Castens tried to take a cheap swing, Morgan was ready, blocking the attack and retaliating. The friend stayed out of it, insisting he wasn't part of this mess. During the scuffle, Morgan learned more than he expected. The friend revealed that Castens had been bragging for months about trying to seduce Bria. Apparently, Castens was confident he'd succeed, but the hotel incident ruined his chances. The guy even admitted Castens had access to pills that would leave women unable to remember anything, though none of the other golf buddies wanted anything to do with it. Morgan shook his head, disgusted. He left without another word, feeling like he had enough to finally confront Bria. On the way home, as the adrenaline wore off, he realized he was starving and stopped for breakfast. It was close to 11 a.m. when he walked into the apartment. Bria and Corey sat at the kitchen table, quietly sipping coffee. Without saying a word, Morgan grabbed the last cup from the pot and sat down. He looked at Corey and simply said, "Can you give us a minute?" But Corey, sensing the tension, asked to stay, hoping to help mediate. Morgan didn't argue. She took the hint, gave Bria a supportive glance, and left for her room. Morgan got straight to the point. "Did you sleep with him?" Bria's response was immediate and firm. "No, and I never intended to." Morgan wasn't convinced yet. He pressed further, wanting to know why she was even seeing Castens. Bria admitted she had flirted, but it was never supposed to go beyond that. She believed he'd sedated her at the motel. Otherwise, she'd never have ended up there. Morgan asked how they'd reconnected. Bria explained she'd dated Castens before getting back together with Morgan, but it ended things as soon as their relationship turned serious. Months later, they bumped into each other at the mall. One lunch turned into another, and soon, dinners followed when Morgan was on night shifts. Bria insisted she never planned for it to escalate, but it became a game, a challenge to resist Castens' advances and prove she was loyal. Morgan wasn't buying the innocent fun excuse. He brought up the motel where Stan had seen them. Bria's tears welled up as she admitted crossing the line by agreeing to dinners, but insisted she never wanted to sleep with Castens. She described how the final night, she'd felt unusually disoriented after only a couple of drinks, leading her to believe Castens had sedated her. Surprisingly, Morgan muttered that he believed her. Bria, hopeful, asked if that meant he wasn't considering divorce. But Morgan wasn't ready to give her that reassurance. He pointed out that while he believed she didn't sleep with Castens, she had still deceived him, managing to hide multiple secret meetings. If she could betray his trust once, what was stopping her from doing it again? Bria's voice cracked as she pleaded with him, reminding him of their vows and how much she loved him. Her tears were genuine, her body trembling with emotion. But Morgan's pain was real too. His father's advice echoed in his head. When faced with a tough decision, weigh the good against the bad, consider every angle, and trust your gut. Right now, his gut was full of uncertainty. Morgan left the apartment without a clear destination, his mind spinning with confusion and frustration. When Bria asked where he was going or when he'd be back, his only response was that he needed space. He shut the door behind him, leaving Bria sobbing at the table. Corey, who'd been in her room trying not to eavesdrop, emerged when she heard the door close. She found Bria in tears, explaining that while Morgan claimed to believe her, he no longer trusted her. Corey comforted her, reminding Bria to see things from Morgan's perspective. Trying to lift the mood, Corey offered to cancel her date with Gerard, but Bria insisted she go. Corey then suggested Bria join them, but Bria declined, insisting Gerard wouldn't want a third wheel on what was supposed to be a romantic night out. Corey teased Bria about finding something in her closet to wear, but Bria laughed it off, still too heartbroken to consider going out. Meanwhile, Morgan aimlessly drove around, unsure where to go until his phone rang. It was Charlie Watt, inviting him to play handball after his partner bailed. At first, Morgan hesitated. He wasn't dressed for it and hadn't played in years. But Charlie convinced him by offering spare gear. Morgan realized blowing off some steam on the court might be exactly what he needed. Morgan stopped by Target to grab some workout clothes and met Charlie at the West Side courts. The game was intense, with Morgan channeling his frustration into every hit. After a grueling match that left Morgan's hands swollen, they declared it a draw. Post-game, they grabbed beers at a nearby bar, where Charlie finally asked who Morgan had been imagining as he pounded the ball. Morgan confessed that Bria's ex, Bob Castens, had sedated her and taken her to a motel. He explained how Stan McCarthy's unexpected intervention had prevented anything worse from happening. Charlie was shocked and asked if Morgan knew where Castens was now. Morgan admitted he'd confronted him that morning, getting into a fight when Castens threw the first punch. Luckily, Morgan had a witness, so he wasn't worried about any legal fallout. Back at the apartment, Bria helped Corey prepare for her date with Gerard. Corey was nervous about wearing Bria's elegant dark purple dress, but Bria insisted. It was too beautiful to sit unworn in a closet. Bria also did Corey's makeup and hair, transforming her into someone unrecognizable, even to herself. Gerard, driving over, was lost in thoughts about how quickly he'd fallen for Corey. He'd worried she might have been married, but learning she wasn't had been a huge relief. Pulling into the apartment complex, he didn't notice the black Cadillac parked nearby. Bria greeted Gerard at the door, inviting him in for coffee while Corey finished getting ready. The absence of Morgan hung heavy, but neither Bria nor Gerard brought it up. When Corey finally emerged, Gerard was speechless, floored by how stunning she looked in the dress. After a brief chat, they headed out, oblivious to the Cadillac quietly tailing them. On the way to Leonardo's, Gerard asked how things were at home. Corey explained that Bria claimed she never intended to sleep with Castens, and while Morgan believed her, he was still hurt by the betrayal of trust. Corey hoped they'd work through it. They clearly loved each other. As Gerard pulled into the restaurant's parking lot, the black Cadillac cruised past. Inside, Tony Spinoza, a hired Colt, prepared for his hit. He'd been tracking Corey for days but hadn't found the right opportunity. Leonardo's was perfect, crowded, chaotic, with multiple exits. The more people, the more confusion when the attack began. Spinoza circled the block and parked in the alley behind the restaurant. He knew the kitchen staff often left the back door ajar for smoke breaks. He swapped the Magnum rounds in his Colt for standard .38s. He didn't need overkill for this job, and slipped the tool into his jacket. He entered through the kitchen unnoticed and scanned the dining room. Spotting Corey with her back to the wall and Gerard facing away, he moved quickly toward them. But as he closed in, Corey's gaze locked onto him. Recognition flashed in her eyes. "It's him!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the hum of the restaurant. "That's the man who attacked me." Gerard noticed the hitman, Spinoza, the moment he drew his Colt. With no time to reach for his own tool, Gerard dove across the table, knocking Corey to the floor and shielding her. A loud commotion erupted, plunging the restaurant into chaos as diners screamed and ducked for cover. Amid the panic, Gerard felt a bullet hit him, but managed to return fire before collapsing. Meanwhile, Morgan, feeling lighter after venting to Charlie and getting in some exercise, decided to head home instead of the motel. Arriving around 7:30, he saw the relief on Bria's face. She offered to make him dinner, but he declined, having already eaten. Before they could talk further, Morgan's phone rang. It was Charlie. "What, you want a rematch already?" Morgan joked, but Charlie's tone was serious. "Morgan, was Corey with Gerard tonight?" Morgan asked Bria, who confirmed Corey was out on a date. That's when Charlie dropped the bomb. Gerard had been wounded. Panicked, Morgan demanded details, but Charlie only knew that Gerard had been taken to Northwestern Hospital, which had the best trauma center in Chicago. Morgan and Bria rushed out the door, their hearts pounding with fear. At the hospital, they hurried to the ER desk. The nurse informed them both men were in surgery but had no information about a woman. Morgan feared the worst. Maybe Corey hadn't survived. But then the nurse mentioned a woman in the back with officers. Just as Morgan was about to demand access, Charlie arrived and waved them through with his badge. Down the hall, they spotted a group of officers and civilians gathered. Bria noticed a familiar figure in a purple dress, Corey. She was sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to Bria as she cried, "He can't die! He can't!" Morgan and Charlie left the women to comfort each other and sought out information. The district commander confirmed Gerard was in surgery with 2 bang wounds to the back. The shooter was identified as Tony Spinoza, a notorious criminal both Morgan and Charlie recognized immediately. The commander explained that based on Corey's account, there wasn't a second shooter. She believed she heard 5 loud bangs, 2 that hit Gerard, and 3 that Gerard fired back at Spinoza. They were waiting to take Corey's full statement once she calmed down. Eventually, Corey and Bria rejoined the men. Corey, still shaken but more composed, hugged Morgan tightly. "I remember everything," she whispered. The commander saw an opportunity and asked Corey if she was ready to give a statement. She agreed, requesting Bria's presence for support. An officer led them to a consulting room where Corey recounted everything, from waking up in the hospital with no memory to recognizing Spinoza in the restaurant. She detailed how Spinoza had pulled her from the car, leaving her stranded on the roadside. While trying to find help, she witnessed him aiming and shooting at another man. When she screamed, he turned and fired at her too. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital, having been attacked by 3 men while semi-conscious from the injury caused by the shooting. Seeing Spinoza that night had triggered all those memories. The officer ended the recording and they returned to the waiting area where the commander updated them. Spinoza had died on the operating table. Gerard was still in surgery. At 2 a.m., a doctor approached. Everyone braced themselves for the worst, but the doctor smiled. "He's going to recover," he announced. "With therapy, I expect a full recovery." Corey collapsed in relief, tears streaming down her face. The group thanked the doctor before heading home, exhausted but hopeful. The car ride back was silent. Everyone was mentally and emotionally drained. Once inside, Morgan took one look at the couch and decided he needed his own bed that night. Within minutes, the entire apartment was asleep. As dawn broke, Corey woke with a start, the previous night's events rushing back. Thoughts of Gerard filled her mind, but seeing Spinoza had unearthed deeper, long-buried memories. She pulled the blanket tight, trying to feel safe as fragments of her past flooded in. Dr. Wahlberg had been right. Corey's life had been hard. Her father was abusive, often coming home drunk and violent. When he finally raised his hand against Corey and her mother, it was the last straw. Her mother packed a bag, grabbed Corey, and left, taking whatever money she could find. They traveled as far as they could by bus, and her mother, though uneducated, worked tirelessly as a waitress to support them. But tragedy struck when Corey's mother died of cancer at just 35. Corey was 16, alone, with no family to turn to. She dropped out of school and convinced the restaurant owner to let her take her mother's job. She had watched her mother work and knew the ropes. To survive, she continued forging her mother's signature on checks and bank slips. Now, as the memories settled, Corey realized she had survived more than just physical wounds. She had endured a lifetime of pain, and yet she was still standing. Corey woke up overwhelmed by memories of her troubled past, years marked by cruelty, grief, and loss. But as the weight of those memories settled in, she realized life had offered her a second chance. Morgan and Bria had given her shelter and care, and Gerard had given her hope. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt surrounded by people who truly mattered. Determined not to let her friends throw away their happiness, Corey stormed into the kitchen and confronted Morgan and Bria. She reminded Morgan how rare their love was and scolded Bria for taking it for granted. Her passionate outburst left both stunned, but it was exactly what they needed. Morgan realized he wasn't ready to give up on his marriage, and Bria vowed never to repeat her mistakes. They reconciled, finding comfort in each other's arms. Meanwhile, Corey prepared to visit Gerard in the hospital. At the front desk, she learned it would be hours before visitors were allowed, but she decided to wait. By midday, a nurse informed her she could see him. When she entered his room, Gerard was already surrounded by fellow officers, but his face lit up when he saw her. The connection between them was undeniable. Over the following week, Corey barely left his side, caring for him so attentively that the nursing staff joked she was part of the team. As Gerard's discharge approached, Corey offered to move in with him during his recovery. Though his arm would be in a cast for weeks, neither of them hesitated at the idea of sharing his one-bedroom apartment. Corey's testimony linked Tony Spinoza to Johnny Ritchie's murder, though they couldn't tie the crime to mob boss Vito Generisi. Meanwhile, Morgan reported Bob Castens for pills possession, leading to charges of intent to distribute. Castens accepted a plea deal, leaving his golf buddies short a player. Despite his difficult divorce, Gerard found love again. A year after meeting Corey, he stood at the altar as she walked down the aisle, with Morgan by her side and Bria as maid of honor. 14 months later, Gerard was promoted to commander. He, Corey, Bria, and Morgan became inseparable, raising families together and cherishing the second chances life had given them. With their support, Corey founded a charity for women affected by violence and displacement, opening 3 shelters across Chicago. Years later, she would sometimes pull out the purple dress Bria had lent her the night of the shooting. Though the dress had been ruined, Bria refused to let her replace it. Corey kept it hidden, a reminder of how far she'd come and a promise never to take Gerard's love for granted.